Uh, Good morning, everybody. It is a great. Thank you for joining today's event, online or here. Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for joining this morning's event, um, despite your busy schedules. My name is Jujin Kim, and I am the Managing Director of Solutions for Our Climate, uh, climate advocacy group based in Seoul, South Korea. Uh, Today, myself and speakers from wonderful climate transparency organizations and WRI are here today, and we have a couple of one speaker coming in late. Before going into the discussion, I would like to briefly introduce who is here today, and explain the about the event today. Today we'll be presenting the key findings of the 2021 Climate Transparency Report, which was published in October this year. And today we have five great speakers here today, all from the Climate Transparency Network. Jorge Villarreal, founder and director of climate policy of ICM, the Mexican Climate Initiative, is here. Hello, Jorge. As those here may know, Korea and Mexico has had a very special climate relationship during the past 30 years. We also have Angela Pizzariello of the Overseas Development Institute, ODI, which has been leading the financial analysis work relating to the climate transparency work. We also have Han Guiti, but I believe she is speaking just next door in the China Pavilion and will be joining in a couple of minutes. We also have David Waskow, Director of International Climate Initiative of the World Resources Institute, WRI. And finally, we have Gert Leopold, the Program Director of Climate Transparency Project and also former Executive Director of Greenpeace International. Thank you so much for making yourselves available today. Today, the program will be myself will be speaking a little bit about the key findings of the recent Climate Transparency Report. I will go through what the report is briefly in a couple of minutes. And then we have a short, about an hour of panel discussion with the people here. And then Gert here will wrap up. So I'll move over to the podium and do my presentation. Sorry. My very big mistake. Before presenting, we have the most important part of our today ceremony today. We have Jenny Kim, Ambassador of Climate Change Ambassador of Korea, here to deliver congratulatory remarks.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. First of all, let me congratulate on the excellent work done by Solution for Our Climate, SFOC. Actually, SFOC has played a significant role and is playing a significant role in rolling out Korea's net zero by 2050 commitment and ambitious NDC by 2030. SFOC's activities have significantly raised actually public awareness on climate action, and the organization is urging government to take more proactive climate actions and invites private sector to shift with green business models. And today at this event, you will discuss how strong leadership of G20 member countries will be in taking climate actions, which is, I believe, extremely important. Let me share the keywords that COP President, Prime Minister of the UK, Boris Johnson, emphasized in his speech at the World Leaders Summit: coal, car, cash, and tree. He urged countries to set an ambitious target to phase out coal and to phase out combustion engine cars, to increase the climate finance, and stop deforestation with planting trees. So, in responding to the calls of Prime Minister Johnson, President Moon Jae-in, he shared Korea's ambitious action as follows. First, the Republic of Korea has enhanced its 2030 NDC targets, cutting greenhouse gas emission by at least 40% from 2018 level. This is indeed a bold target that has been raised some 14 percentage points from the previous one. A challenging task indeed, which demands steep emission cuts over a short time period. Korea also cemented its 2050 net zero commitment into law and announced its carbon neutrality scenarios. So, recently passed Korean law, which is called Framework Act on Carbon Neutrality and Green Growth. Net zero by 2050 is there, so our commitment to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050, it's not just a political commitment, it's legal commitment as well. And we pledged to lower methane emissions as well. We joined the Global Methane Pledge, committing to reduce by 30% by the year of 2030. And secondly, Korea also drives cooperation in forest restoration. So we endorsed the Glasgow Leaders Declaration on Forests and Land Use and promised to fully cooperate in strengthening forests in developing countries. In May next year, in Seoul, Korea is going to host the World Forestry Congress, and yes, which is the world's largest forest conference, and I hope all of you will be there next year in Seoul in May. And Korea also pledged to join the global efforts to reduce the use of coal. So by 2050, all coal-fired power generations will be phased out in Korea. We already stopped issuing new permits for domestic coal power plants. And in April this year, we suspended public financing for new overseas coal-fired power generations. And on top of that, we will fully cooperate with developing countries in order to support their transition to a low-carbon green economy. For the purpose, we decided to establish Korean Green New Deal Fund in Global Green Growth Institute in order to support developing countries to set up their own Green New Deal strategy and plans. Also, Korea will continue to increase its green ODA so that it reaches more than triple until 2025. So, what are the most frequently referred numbers at this COP26? If I pick up, I must say it's 1.5, because 1.5 degree ambition, that's the top priority of this COP. And every actions and initiatives, alliances are mainly targeting how to achieve 1.5 degree ambition by the end of this century. So we really need to work further in order to achieve the target, because the accumulated data says, very recent data says, if all commitments, announcements by leaders will be accumulated, we may achieve 1.8 degree. Still, there is a gap. So, how to narrow the gap? That's our homework, and we have to strengthen our actions. And in all those activities, actions, and commitments, I strongly believe that the role of G20 is crucial. They must play a leading role in making progress in global climate action. And in that line, actually, today's event is really meaningful and timely as well. Therefore, I congratulate again to all the panelists for having very fruitful discussion today. And also I welcome all the audience to this meaningful event. And I hope this session is going to provide real insight to not only G20 member countries, but also to all UNFCCC members and other stakeholders, including civil society, universities, private sector as well. And this is the step. I believe this is not just a one-time event. I think we have to continue our collaboration so that the meaningful progress to achieve 1.5 degree ambition can happen. Thank you, and I wish all the success of today's event.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, despite your very busy schedule, joining today's event. Ambassador Kim may have to leave early due to other negotiations scheduled. Thank you very much, and I am terribly sorry for despite because of the busyness of this morning, I forgot mentioning that Ambassador Kim is here. I am. As mentioned at the beginning, I will briefly talk about the key findings of the 2020 Climate Transparency Report. It was a great privilege to have worked with climate transparency partners on this report. Just to give you a brief introduction for those who are here and are online, what climate transparency is. Climate transparency is a partnership of 16 organizations around the world. We are also part of Solutions for Our Climate, the organization I am with, who is inside the network. And we have ICM and ODI, and Climate Analytics unfortunately was not available to come here, and many other partners around the world in the G20 nations are in the network. The main feature of the climate transparency work is that it analyzes climate progress around the world using 100 indicators, 100 homogeneous indicators, where you can really objectively observe where the climate progress status is per country. Two kinds of reports are published. There are country profiles, so I put up the South Korea profile. It's about 16, 20 pages, I believe. I'm not familiar with the numbers. And then there's a highlights report summarizing the findings of the 20 profile reports. We have been, for this year, the SFOC team has prepared the highlights report, and Climate Analytics has been providing the country profiles, and ODI here has prepared the finance section of the analysis. I will go over three or four key findings of the climate transparency report this year. According to the announcements made until April, NDC announcements made until April this year, there still is a big emissions gap. 23 gigatons remains between the 1.5 degrees Celsius pathway, which means that we are still at only 4 degrees world by 2100. In order to, if the G20 aligned its targets and policies with 1.5 degree pathways, this gap could be reduced to 1.7 degrees. Unfortunately, most G20 members fall into the highly insufficient or critically insufficient category, according to the Climate Action Tracker, CAT's new rating system. You can see the new rating system down below in red and orange and green. adjust the slides there and then they can go over. Sorry about that. The graph kind of shows the green line, the green sections there show where the 1.5 degrees pathway is according to climate analytics. And then the orange section is the policy projection, and the gap is between, the gap is, the black gap there is the gap between the target and the 1.5 degrees pathway. So, and then the line underneath is the rating under the climate action tracker analysis done by Climate Action Tracker. Sort of complicated draft, but we tried to compile a lot of information into one. I think this graph here kind of shows you the reality of the post-COVID world in the climate scene. Unfortunately, despite the decline in 2020, 6% decline in 2020 due to COVID, emissions, according to NR data, has rebounded by 4%. In OECD G20 members, that rebound was less intensive. The rebound will not fully offset the decline, despite the USA's rebound to 5%. However, in non-OECD G20 countries, the rebounds are a little bit more significant. Argentina, China, Indonesia were those kind of countries. And these countries accounted for almost half of the G20's energy-related CO2 emissions in 2020. So we're back in business as usual, despite the dip due to COVID-19. Coal phase-out has been a very important topic at this COP, as you may know. And as many know, China accounts for over half of the G20's total coal power capacity, followed by India and the USA. And you can really see how India and US are even dwarfed by the size of the China new coal power fleet. Indonesia and Turkey also fall. France, Italy, and the UK are rated as front-runners for coal phase-out policies. And as many know, all G20 members will need to phase out, depending on whether they're OECD and non-OECD, between 20 and 30 and 2040 to limit global average temperature to 1.5 degrees Celsius. It's a big challenge to the world, and I believe that we will overcome it. Here you can find a summary of the 5-year trends and current decarbonization ratings. I won't go too much into details, but what the graph here, the colors in the graph represent the ratings provided by Climate Analytics of the policy of each country, and the percentage numbers inside the circles represent the figures, represent the changes during the 5 years since 2015 and 2020. Korea, I'll go into the second line there, which shows the growth in share of renewables. Korea and Saudi Arabia are on the right side, showing a 163% and 523% growth in renewable energies, which seems good, but they're red, which means their renewable generation mix is very low. This graph means that despite very high increase during the 5-year period, this means that the share of renewables in these countries were generally very low. And I think these indicators will provide a very good sense of where each 20 countries' policies are. You can see the more detail. I won't go too much in details in the figures here. And all of this data is on the Climate Transparency Report, very neatly organized. Another important report feature of the Climate Transparency Network is that we provide country profile reports for all G20 members. It's an analysis using same indicators for all G20 countries, including key 1.5 IPCC benchmarks, key opportunities for increasing ambition, recent policy developments, and policy ratings and updates. Most of the G20 countries members are country profiles are made available on the on the Climate Transparency website, and we encourage everybody to refer to. I'll go into a couple of slides inside, since we're today in the Korea Pavilion, a couple of slides inside the Korea country profile report. We can see this slide, I believe, is the slide on coal financing, and As you can see, coal financing is quite high. Japan, China, Korea are the biggest financiers of coal and oil and gas. The Korean decision to end coal financing was followed by similar announcements by Japan and China, which was a very good climate progress this year. And with this, in a couple of minutes, I believe my good friend Han Gu-ti will be here, and she will be able to explain how that has affected the Vietnamese power sector. I hear that the Vietnam government had no choice but to drastically cut their future new coal power plant pipeline due to these decisions, which was a very good climate contribution. As mentioned, Korea is the third largest provider of public finance for coal and oil and gas, providing an average of $500 million per year for the coal sector and a lot more money for the oil and gas sector. And if coal was like one, we have a big challenge with moving financing from the oil and gas sector. Coal, and this is another graph you can find inside the Climate Transparency Country Profile Report. As you can see, this shows Korea's power mix. Coal is still 20% by 2030, despite the IEA recommendation to phase out coal by 2030. The share of renewable PV and wind is still low, less than 5%, with obstacles mainly in permitting and grid access. We don't have Korea. Well, when this slide was presented, there was no, but we do officially have a 2050 coal phase out year, but still no coal power plants are still under construction. Unfortunately, we have a highly insufficient rating under the CAT, Climate Action Tracker rating, and we should be at 278 million tons by 2030 to meet the 1.5 degrees target. Common feature in Asia. This is less about the climate change. This is more about my point. The outdated power sector and legacy fossil fuel generation, asset inertia is the main cause of slow ambition. And I think as the world talks about coal phase out, and with so many nations signing on to the clean to coal announcement, which many people may have different ways of interpreting, but it's basically saying that we're not going to do any coal in some time period in the next 10 or 20 years. This kind of shows us the next challenge of the climate world, and I think a lot of that challenge, especially because a lot of the climate laggards are in Asia, should focus on the outdated power sector. Companies, state-owned utilities, I believe, should become not just a national problem, but a global climate problem. The bundled, vertically integrated, and monopolized nature of Asian state-owned utilities has been blocking access of new, innovative, renewable technology into the grid. They've been using technology standards, very reluctant on making the grid flexible, and bringing in good pricing policies for batteries, renewable technology, and to protect their legacy fossil fuel assets. And the problem is that this barrier in the power sector is infecting the industrial sector. Our steel sector, for example, is losing confidence in becoming net zero by 2050 because of these developments, because of difficulties in the power sector. And I think there should be some more direct political messaging on the problems of Asian national energy companies. And I think lessons should be learned from unbundling experiences in the EU in 2009, or the Eastern European energy transition stories. Not the best stories, but from an Asian perspective, what happened in Eastern Europe is still very meaningful. So these are my points for today. Thank you very much for coming again, and we will move on to a discussion after I move over to the seat over there. So, thank you very much. I'd first like to ask ask for some intervention from Jorge. As you may know, Mexico has a special climate relationship with Korea. And Mexico, Korea, and Switzerland has been leading the Environmental Integrated Group, a quite well-established negotiating group in climate negotiations. However, I'm not 100% sure how much Korean climate partners will be aware of Mexico's climate policy challenges. And it would be great. It would be great if you could kind of inform us of some key findings that were found in the country profile report of Mexico and the challenges that you see in Mexico.
Thank you very much, Eugene. And for me, it's really a pleasure to be here with you. And thank you very much to Solutions for Our Climate for the invitation. As you mentioned, Mexico and Korea has a long story of good cooperation. We have been long-standing allies and friends in so many issues. And in particular, regarding climate change, as you clearly said, we have been partners since the very beginning in the Environmental Integrity Group. And this joint cooperation, while negotiating together, I think that will be a very good motive to increase discussion and to share information within the group or with our allies about the Mexican climate policy. Because in the past, Mexico has had international climate leadership by promoting, for instance, the GCF, by managing the COP26 and many other components, mainly on climate finance. Which Mexico has been really into it and taking a strong leadership in the past. But now Mexico has lost that international climate leadership due to its political position on climate change. Unfortunately, and the country profile of the Climate Transparency Report said that Mexico has a highly insufficient commitment to be aligned with the 1.5 per share trajectory. If the world will emit the same level as Mexico, the world will be higher, or the increase of the temperature will be higher than 3 degrees. So more action needs to be taken, and there are strong contradictions in our in-house climate policy with the energy and the forestry policy of the current administration. Mexico has a bet. The president and the federal government has a strong aim. They are keen to really push forward the exploitation of fossil fuels. And for instance, we have not signed the coal, the recent announcements for coal Phaseout, while coal for Mexico represents between the 4 and the 8% of the power generation, but emits between the 10 and the 18% of the GHG emissions for the electricity sector. So this is why and the strong position on fossil fuels by the federal administration really jeopardizes every climate commitment. And I really aim that the good cooperation that we have had within the Environmental Integrity Group and the cooperation that we have had for a long-standing with Korea, it will be useful to invite Mexico to follow the example of Korea. It would be, there are some key opportunities in the short term. For instance, Mexico has to review and update its NDC, because the NDC that we submitted last year, it is the reduction commitment of 22% non-conditional by 2030 remains the same and of the one of 2015. So, but even worse, considering the changes on the business as usual projection, emission projection, the commitment for to reduce emissions expressed in net tons is even lower now than 2015. So it's it's really amazing that we are some of the few countries within the G20 that are stepping back on the climate change commitment. So opportunities are there. For instance, coal phase-out is one. Second, a deployment on renewable energy is the second. We have a large potential for renewable energy, but the current energy policies of the federal administration are really backsliding every effort to deploy renewable energy in the country by prioritizing fossil fuels. Third, fuel efficiency and transport, not only EV. A larger deployment is an opportunity for Mexico for fuel efficiency standards, as well as we and you all can watch into our report and into the country profile. And third opportunity will be a follow. Mexico is playing or should be playing a key role on maintaining the natural skins, the natural sinks, and but on the contrary, the current policy is also threatening that by implementing a large-scale project to change the land use, will change the forestry to agricultural use. So those are the three opportunities that I will highlight within these dialogues of cooperation and good alliance and friendship that Mexico has with Korea. Thank you, Eugene.
Thank you very much, Jorge. Coal phase out, energy efficiency, and AFOLU, as you mentioned, as the main opportunities that we have. Unfortunately, Claire Stockwell of Climate Analytics was not available to make it here today. We were expecting to hear a little bit about the recent Climate Action Tracker ratings that Climate Analytics and New Climate Institute published a couple of days ago, but that will not be possible. But I believe that David is slightly aware of the Climate Action Tracker developments, and then and would like to hear a little bit about his understanding of the recent ratings that made available by Climate Action Tracker. And then it would also be great if we could hear a little bit how he sees the U.S. government has considered Korea or Japan in the international climate discussions, and what kind of leadership the U.S. government will expect from countries like Korea or Japan.
Great. Thank you very much, Jujin, and thank you for including me in this event. So yeah, let me briefly touch on some of the recent findings we've seen from a number of studies on where we stand in terms of mitigation ambition and temperature levels. And you touched on some of it earlier, so I'll just underscore some of the key points. We produced a report just ahead of the G20 meeting. I'm sorry, a month ahead of the G20 meeting, actually, just ahead of the UN General Assembly in September, looking at what the commitments at that point in time would result in terms of temperature levels. And what we found was that there was quite an opportunity with net zero announcements in particular, that those could drive where we end up on temperature levels in a quite significant way. But that we weren't, and I think this is reflected in the slide that you showed earlier, we were not seeing the kind of short-term action that's needed in order to get us on track for those outcomes that we need in terms of driving temperature change down. So as you noted, there have been estimates that we could, in fact, be on track for 1.7 degrees, for example, if we had all G20 countries take on net zero commitments, as well as get aligned with 1.5 degrees in terms of their short-term 2030 targets. We also saw, I think, the IEA last week really grabbed a lot of headlines with their announcement that all of the announcements and targets and so forth so far could get us on track for 1.8 degrees. I think what's noteworthy in all of that analysis is that the net zero announcements of various kinds are really doing the heavy lifting, in a sense. And we now have all but one. It's actually Mexico is the one exception. We have all but one of the G20 countries with net zero announcements and commitments of some kind or other. The timelines differ. How well embedded these are in national law differs, but we do have that. The problem, of course, is that the 2030 targets are not aligned. And so we've seen, for example, Climate Action trackers say within the past few days that we're on track. If you look just at the NDC component of action, we're on track for about 2.4 degrees. The emissions gap report from UNEP came out with numbers a couple of days ago as well that showed we're on track for roughly 2.5. So what we see across the board, I think, in all of this analysis is that we have the potential to go quite deep and get close to 1.5 degrees, but the short-term action, where we're headed for 2030, and I would emphasize also current policies don't really drive us in that direction adequately. So with that as context, let me turn a bit to the U.S. and Japan and Korea. And I think that one of the interests the U.S. has had, in fact, and this goes back to earlier in the year, is to work with Japan and Korea to, in fact, get on track in terms of those near-term commitments. And so we saw the Japanese announcement of its increased target for its NDC. We saw the U.S. work with Korea around its target, which is now announced for its NDC. I think all of this with Japan and Korea for the U.S. is in the context of an effort to really move the Asia-Pacific region. I think they see the region as quite critical. In part, that's for geopolitical reasons that I'm sure you all can imagine. But also, I think, because the region is so important in terms of coal use and the emissions implications because of that coal use. So I'll just point to a few areas, not just coal, but I'll point to a few areas where I think the U.S. has some particular interests. One is coal financing internationally, and there, as noted earlier, Korea really took an important first step, then followed by Japan and China. I think it is interesting to think about whether the next sort of horizon in financing internationally is oil and gas. And the U.S. joined with around 20 other countries within the past few days. I've forgotten timelines now during the COP about a week ago to say that they would phase out international financing for all fossil fuels, including oil and gas. So I do think that's the next horizon. And we'll see how Korea and Japan might fit into that picture. Second area is, of course, coal consumption at home. And here we see the U.S. on a pathway to phasing out coal consumption. It's gone from 40% of its electricity from coal in 2014 to about 20% last year. There's been some fluctuation because of the COVID impacts, but we're roughly in those numbers, I would say, in the U.S. and headed downward. John Kerry says it'll be gone by 2030. Certainly the U.S., the Biden administration has a goal of all clean electricity in the U.S. by 2035. So that is an area where I think the U.S. will be working with and expecting other countries also to engage in fairly rapid coal phase-outs. And then the last item I want to mention is methane. And both Korea and Japan signed the Global Methane Pledge last week. And what's interesting is that much of the attention has gone to oil and gas, and clearly that's an important part of it. I think as principally as consumers of oil and gas, Korea and Japan will be important in addressing methane emissions in those sectors. But it's important to keep in mind that roughly half of all methane emissions are from agriculture and food sector emissions, including food waste. About 40% of methane from agriculture specifically, and there are actually quite important opportunities in both the livestock sector and rice production, which are quite relevant for both countries that I think could be tapped. We're about to see, I think, fairly rapid innovation in the livestock sector with feed additives. For example, there are rice production techniques that are possible, that are being used and could be scaled up. So again, I think this is an area where the U.S. has led, and I think wants other countries to join in as well.
Thank you, David. Thank you, David. And I think David might have to leave early because he has a important meeting with the with the delegation. So thank you very much for making yourself available today. I would like to then move over to Angela and ask whether she could summarize and note a little bit of other finance-related findings of the report and provide comments on fossil fuel finance announcements made last week. I think David also mentioned a little bit about that.
Thank you, Georgine, and thanks so much for Solutions for Our Climate and the Korea Pavilion for organizing this and inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. So yeah, I would like to provide a brief overview of the finance-related findings from the Climate Transparency Report. And maybe just to make a premise on this, the reason why in the Climate Transparency Report over the past few years we've been tracking G20 countries' ambition and progress against a number of finance indicators is that one of the key objectives of the Paris Agreement is to align all finance flows to a low-carbon, climate-compatible pathway. That's why it makes sense to look at finance from a number of perspectives, which is what we try to do in the report. So one of the elements that we look at in the report is what we call fossil fuel subsidies provided by the G20. In this case, we mean domestic subsidies to the production and consumption of fossil fuels that G20 countries provide. The latest data that we've got in the report with respect to fossil fuel subsidies are for 2019, and they are OECD data, which is useful to mention. In some cases, for many countries, they are largely underestimates of the real amount of subsidies that we have. But yeah, we use those for cross-country consistency. We think there is a merit in having a useful comparison across countries. So what happened with respect to fossil fuel subsidies? We see that these subsidies have remained high in the G20 generally. In 2019, they amounted to $152 billion in aggregate when you don't consider Saudi Arabia, because we don't have comparable data for Saudi Arabia. And this is a huge number because it doesn't represent much of a decrease compared to the previous year's data that we have, and because also half of these subsidies go to oil, which is also an interesting insight. Of course, it's an aggregate picture, so when you look at specific countries, you see that some countries have done better than others, phasing out some of the subsidies. So we have looked at 5-year trends for each of the G20 countries, and we've seen that countries like Argentina or China actually have decreased their subsidies per unit of GDP. But we've also seen countries like France, like Mexico, Russia increasing their subsidies substantially over the past 5 years. Now, we have also some preliminary data for 2020, for last year. And we see that there has been a decrease in the provision of fossil fuel subsidies for the G20, 9% decrease according to the OECD. But again, this data has to be taken with a pinch of salt because mostly they seem to be due to the commodities price crash on the one hand, to the fact that due to COVID restrictions and lockdowns, less subsidies were pushed into the mobility sector. And in fact, when we look at the recovery as a whole, so not only fossil fuel subsidies, but energy investment commitments done by the G20, we see that that hasn't been as green as the rhetoric as suggested in most countries. So we see that G20 countries have generally committed around, according to the Energy Policy Tracker, which is one of the trackers that looks at the recovery, half of the total energy investment recovery spending to fossil fuel sectors. The positive news, I guess, there is that if you look at how the recovery spend has evolved over time, you see that has been getting greener and greener with time. So probably moving from the, emergency rescue measures to the more structured recovery measures, we've seen that governments have effectively greened their investments a bit. Probably not enough for what we need to comply with the Paris Agreement goals, but something has been done there. And yeah, I'd like to touch on a last point regarding public finance for fossil fuels for overseas projects. So it's something that you guys both touched upon. And it's something that we also track in terms of numbers, in terms of indicators in the report. So we basically computed the total amount of finance provided by public finance institutions of the G20 countries, so national development banks and export credit agencies for fossil fuel projects in other countries overseas. We use the Oil Change International data for this, and we see that in the 2018-2019, so we have that yearly average, G20 countries have provided $50 billion to financing of projects which are fossil fuel related, which again is a big number. 3/4 of this goes to oil, which is also an interesting number in terms of policies and what do you want to phase out. Obviously, there has been great announcements in the last few days, and again, I won't repeat much of this, but these are big milestones for all of us, and for us working in this field. It's great to see that a number of countries have announced the coal phase-outs, have brought some of the dates forward. Of course, would be great to have that for more countries and for earlier dates even, but that's great. Equally, for the financing of fossil fuels for overseas projects, it's great to see that 20 plus countries right now have announced that the end date for that is 2022, that they will include oil and gas projects, which is actually, of course, much better than the previous G20 commitment, which was only restricting financing for coal projects. So a great step forward there. I think of course, what is missing and is very relevant in this context is the fact that the biggest financiers of mostly oil and gas projects overseas, the Asian countries, are for the moment not included in there. The countries that are included in this statement finance a good chunk of the total finance, around 18 billion per year, but again, not the biggest share. So we need more in that sense. But yeah, definitely nice to see that something is moving, and I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Your last statement on oil and gas financing makes me tempted to refer to a little bit about a report we have here. Those who have a postcard here will be able to find a link to one of the reports that our organization produced, Fueling the Climate Crisis. Going back to, you mentioned $18 billion per year by the signatories. We're in the Korea Pavilion. I'm sorry to say this, but the Korean government export credit agencies finance about $13 billion a year for fossil fuel financing, overseas fossil fuel financing. About 5.7 billion per year of that money goes to our shipbuilding sector. LNG carriers, VLCCs. Korea has the largest shipbuilding industry. It's 2%. Shipbuilding is about 2% of the economy. And with the oil and gas sector pretty explicitly, evidently going down, Korea will experience a big just transition problem, which the world will have to overcome, or else our government will be continuing financing these oil and gas midstream, upstream facilities. So there seems to be a big challenge there, and I think how fast Asian nations can join that will be an issue. When talking about finance, there were positive developments this year on finance. Han, I think it would be good for you to. Yes. Han Guy, the executive director of the Green Innovation and Development Center of Vietnam, has joined today's discussion. She was just right now in the Chinese pavilion, China corporate pavilion, actually with a discussion where Xie Jianhua attended. I'm curious what she heard as well. But before that, it would be great if you could tell us how the Asia, Korea, Japan, China, coal finance moratorium decisions affected the Vietnam power sector and what further challenges there might be. For example, the expansion of LNG power plants there, or renewable curtailments that may happen there, that may be happening there. And it would be great if you could share a little bit what you heard in the China Corporate Pavilion just right now.
Yeah. Yes. So, good morning, everyone. I'm sorry for coming late because I just have a session with our friend from China. We talk about how the renewable energy sector should be accelerate with the cooperation of Southeast Asia and China, and come back to the question of how the phasing out of the coal finance from Korea, Japan, and China will affect the power development in Vietnam. So the Vietnam is preparing the power development plan number 8, and this power plant will develop every 10 years, and it will revise every 5 years. So 2011, the government planned to build 75,000 megawatt of coal power by 2030. It's huge amount of coal will be imported. I think two-thirds of coal fuel will be imported to generate the power if this plan is implemented. Luckily, in 2016, our government revised the power plant and it cut about 20,000 megawatt of coal out of this pipeline. So it still have a 55,000 aim for 2030. However, when Korean, Japan make announcement, I think last year, on the coal, phasing out for abroad, it makes the challenge for many projects in Vietnam, especially for the project it intend to have the Korean involvement. So as I know, one project in a province in the south of Hanoi, it assumed to be to start the construction 5 years ago, but it cannot. So it now moved to China. So after the Korean withdraw from the finance, and then they start again with Chinese business with the effort to try to mobilize the finance. And after Japan and Koreans make the decision, the Chinese finance is the only sources that the coal power developer in Vietnam looking for. But with the recent Chinese president's announcement, I think that it put about 16,000 megawatt of coal power in the pipelines in danger, and many projects we see the massive withdrawal from the Chinese business community. So we checked and we found that about 16,000 megawatt of coal power in Vietnam in the pipeline will not a highly will be dead because of the withdrawal from the Chinese business community. And yesterday, the government office request the Ministry of Trade and Industry to revise the current draft of the Power Development Plan number 8. And the revision have to take into account the commitment the Prime Minister made at COP. It means that the new PDP have to make in line with the commitment that Vietnam intend to achieve net zero by 2050. And our quick analysis showing that the renewable have to jump up, and it have to occupy maybe about at least 85% of the power mix. That is the direction it should move. But come back to the current draft of PDP, the government reduced coal. Even it still have a lot of coal projects in the power plant, but they intend to replace coal by gas. So massive proposed LNG project has been bringing, and I think that Korean and Japanese business community are excited on gas development plant. However, I would like to share the risk for gas. It is we all witness this is the big infrastructure investment, and it also depends a lot on the related infrastructure like port, because if we don't have a port, it's also very challenging for LNG to develop in Vietnam. And the first LNG project proposed by U.S. Company start I think 5 years ago, but it's not yet start the construction yet. So I think that is the legal challenge, and also the infrastructure challenge need to be well taken into account by developer or the financier when you think about the investment on LNG. And I see that with our government's new direction, and I heard that it is from the top, not only the government, but from Politburo, for the direction of our country to move to cleaner. I think that is the right moment for the business and investor community to think about how their effort can show to support for our government ambitions on green investment, not fossil fuel. So that is what I think I want, and also that is a message I want to bring in to this panel.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We have gone through a round of... David, thank you very much for coming. We have gone through a round of comments from our interventions from our excellent panels. I'm curious whether anybody in the audience may have some questions or inputs from what they've just heard right now. If not, Gert, I'm not going to ask you right now for the ending remarks, but I just wanted to ask whether you had any kind of, from your experience and views, what kind of thoughts you have from the discussion today. You may have noticed that the COP world is changing a lot. Coal has become a very important topic. What kind of challenges do you see? And
well, I would like to ask Khan and you, Chu-Jin, whether, if you compare the situation in your countries to 2 years ago, are you more optimistic? Do you think we have made big progress, and do you think the progress will continue if it's there?
May I start first? Yes. Yes. So, thank you so much for your question. Frankly, if 2 months ago, I am not so optimistic as I am now, because even within the last 2 years, Vietnam we need a great development of renewable. We have about 20,000 megawatt of renewable from solar and wind. It's connected to the grid just within 2 years. I think it's enormous effort from business, from government, and from society. It shows a huge potential for moving green. But that first round of renewable boom still lack of a firm or constant policies and incentive support, because after FIT we didn't see a clear direction of what should be the policy to further support for renewables. And the high curtailment of renewables recently happened because of the in parallel investment on grid infrastructure. And I think that it also needs to have a lot of change in the power market to be able to harmonize with the new sources. Look at the moving over the last 2 years. Yes, it have a lot of progress, but the concern is that with the current policy, if it approved, it will not create a hope. Before I coming here, but at COP, our Prime Minister make ambitious announcement. Now I think that it creates hope for me and for our alliance and our people. But we also well aware that we have a lot of challenge ahead. It needs to overcome in the green journey.
Thank you, Khan. I think Khan. I will have to mention something very similar to what Han mentioned right now, and from a kind of different perspective. We have in our renewable ratio is, I think, the story, a story that my colleagues will have heard about several times, and a story that I may have first mentioned to my colleagues here. I think it would be worthwhile to mention the story about an island grid we have in Korea, which has enough renewables to make the island 100% renewables. It's actually like 60% renewables during the day, and which is very rare in Asia.
Yeah.
The Jeju Island, which is a very well-known tourist destination, has plenty of wind and solar already. Curtailments are extensively happening, and the island has about the same amount of gas and diesel plants as wind and solar plants. And guess who decides who goes into the grid and who gets curtailed or not? The owner of the gas power plants practically decides what batteries receive, what wind and solar price are, and when solar and wind can access the grid. There's definitely a governance issue here. There's a structural issue here that I think the EU or the US has overcome in the past. And as Vietnam goes into net zero, which will, on the flip side, is coal phase out and a lot of gas going out. And same with Korea. This is happening. I mentioned in my slide, for those of you who may have seen my slide, I mentioned that in 2030, why we have 22% of coal by 2030, still, despite the OECD target of zero. Reliability and the stability of the grid is the reason. And who says that? It's the people who own legacy power plants who usually provide the data, own the data. And this is a problem. This is, I think, a global climate issue. The Asian power sector has been part of the Asian economic success story, but now it is bogging down climate progress in the region. And I think not just the domestic countries should look into this, but the world as a community has to look into the problem of Asian state-owned utilities. EVN, PLN, KEPCO, Japanese power companies, TEPCO, J-Power, all of them have similar issues, very common problem in the region. And I think this should become a more political agenda. Those are my points, Kurt.
Maybe.
Oh, yes, we have a question from the audience. I think you'll have to come up and use this mic or that one over there.
That is rating.
Is that working? Hi, Gavin McFadgen. I run the climate program at the Australian Conservation Foundation. I've got two questions. One for the Vietnamese speaker. Thank you for your time. Are you seeing a strong push to increase coal and gas imports from Australia, given Australia is the largest exporter of coal and gas, especially to Asia? Are you seeing this push? And my second question for the Korean and Vietnamese speakers is, what role do you see for hydrogen imports from Australia and other countries to help meet your future energy and decarbonising needs? What role do you see for hydrogen?
I'll go for the easy hydrogen question. Yes, we do see some hydrogen opportunities from Australia. We are discussing with Australian stakeholders on this as well. The problem is that hydrogen policy in I'm not sure about Vietnam, but Korea hasn't been well established. It hasn't been mainly focused on the industry sector, more on the electric passenger vehicle or the power generation system, which is not typically used in other areas. sort of because of industry lobby. But we will realize the problem. There will be a need to decarbonize our steel sector, and that will entail some discussions on how to use hydrogen, coming mainly from Australia, which has abundant renewable sources. And we've been seeing strong Australian subnational, national government engagement on that issue.
Yes, I also would like to follow up with Jujin on. I see that it has a huge potential for collaboration on hydrogens between Vietnam, Australia, and maybe also Korea. That is, we need to put, and that is the right moment now. Otherwise, it will be very late. And I think the policy opportunity opens because with the commitment now, it's a time to look for what is the solution we need to put in the table of decision maker. Vietnam and Australia, I think, have a very good cooperation, but in the past, the power sector mainly rely on coal discussion. So if we have an opportunity to bring up in the discussion of how we should shift, from the coal-based cooperation to hydrogen technology transfer and collaboration, I think that is both welcome. And just to share with you, we as the civil society accelerate clean energy transition in Vietnam. We organize every year 1 week event to talk about energy transition and renewable energy. And we are preparing one session to discuss about hydrogen this year. So we really would like to cooperate or discuss further with you to see how we can connect and discuss and organize this.
Thank you. If I could add on to what Han has mentioned, would it be possible to ask Jorge what kind of positive developments you see, what kind of opportunities you see in the Mexican climate policy context? Maybe, I hope it's not too pessimistic, but in connection with what just Han just mentioned.
To be very honest here, I do not foresee a specific window of opportunity for the next 3 years. Well, maybe. Let me get back. There is one, which is the international cooperation, maybe mainly because Mexico is not only an G20 or OECD country, but also is part of the USMCA, the US and Canada cooperation agreement, trade cooperation agreement. And the North American agenda is really relying in a more regional approach and not only in a country approach. So the US policy and Canada are really pushing forward on trying to enhance the climate action for the region. And that could be, or that is actually a window of opportunity for Mexico to really avoid a deeper backsliding on its climate action and to increase the climate commitment, but not only the climate commitment, but in particular, as you were mentioning, the deployment of renewable energy to not change the legal framework which has been promoting a large-scale deployment for renewable energy in the country for the last 4 or 5 years. But now it has been stopped by the federal government, and the president is aiming to change the legal framework that has been allowing the renewable its deployment. And with the bilateral agenda, the North American approach, that will be much more difficult. Last week, 3 weeks ago, John Kerry, the special envoy for climate change, was at Mexico with the president, and it was for the first time in 3 years that our president mentioned the word climate change. So we saw that as a small win. And now the President Biden and the ambassador in Mexico, Ken Salazar, the ambassador of the U.S. In Mexico, they have been really active and vocal on appointing the risk of the measures to really halt renewable energy deployment in Mexico. So that could be a window of opportunity. Trying to be more optimistic, Eugene.
Thank you. Thank you, Jorge. I think it was a very, very good conversation we had today from very diverse global perspectives, and I think it's time to lean onto the wisdom of Gert, a person I highly respect. Gert, what do you think of today's discussion? And then great if you could provide some final remarks on your observations.
Well, I think it was a very interesting discussion. Today, by the way, the 11th of November is when in this country and in France the end of the First World War is celebrated. In our country it's the beginning of Carnival. Now that shows how history is sometimes seen slightly different in different countries. There's no direct connection. We have seen two very momentous years, I believe, and I would not necessarily have expected it. We have seen an enormous, we have seen the corona crisis, which has shown us what a global crisis is and how much it challenges our society. We have also seen more and more the signs of the climate crisis, and we haven't found a good answer to it. We have, however, a worldwide awakening of the public, an awareness and an interest in the subject as we have never seen before. And this is not just in a few countries, I think it's around the world. I think we have also seen scientists speaking out and governments responding to it. The announcements which we have seen from governments are unexpected if you compare it to what you could expect 2 years ago. And I think, and we heard a number of examples of how the international cooperation was important in this one, and that countries, governments felt obliged to make announcement, net zero announcement of ending fossil fuel, ending the financing of international coal. And they did that not necessarily out of deep conviction, but they felt in order to be a good member of the international community, they had to follow. It also happened, and I think that one shouldn't underestimate that, and Khan gave a few examples of that the investing companies are getting nervous. And I think the Chinese companies are an especially good example of it. It was not just that they were getting nervous because of a potential end of the guarantees by their country. It was that they thought it's not a solid long-term investment anymore, as coal shouldn't be. And because it's not a solid investment, any reasonable investor will say rather not and look for new possibilities. We heard about some new possibilities that are there. So I think we have a lot of developments, good developments. The reality, however, of emissions is a very sobering one, in spite of the dip which we had through the corona economic effects. Emissions are going up again. We are still in a business as usual. So we have the right plans, we have good plans, good intentions, but implementing them and make them stronger is still very much what we need. We heard that there is lots of potential for cooperation. Jorge mentioned that, for example, Mexico and Korea can work together on the NDCs. They can work together on coal phase-out and on renewables. There's joint interest, joint experiences, joint knowledge of it. There's also, and I think that, if I may say that about climate transparency, the ability of NGOs, of think tanks to work together internationally. And I was very pleased that Solutions for Our Climate was doing a key part of this year's report. Pleased not just for the excellent work they have been doing, but I think in the international climate discussions we have too much intelligence analysis coming from Western organizations. I have nothing against them, I'm part of them, I think they do very good work. But we need a wider and a more global perspective. We need that the knowledge in other parts of the world, and in particular of the Asia-Pacific region, which will be undoubtedly the one region which will decide whether we will manage to resolve the climate crisis or not. That more knowledge, more analysis, more taking a public role is needed, and in that respect I'm very grateful for Solutions for Our Climate and hope that this useful collaboration can continue. We heard about the temperature targets, and we heard a lot of numbers recently, anything from, even now we are looking at 2.4, 1.8, 1.7 degree. It's all a bit complicated, but if you take the 1.8 number, it's good to know that this is with a probability of 50% that we could reach that. And a probability of 50% if you play a game in roulette is a very high good one. When you cross the street and have a 50% probability to be hit by a bus, that's very bad. And in climate change, a 50% probability is simply too low for us. We need to stay closer to the 1.5 degree and not the 2.4, which I think is a realistic estimate right now. One of the good developments is that you don't hear the term 2 degrees anymore. And if you think back only 5 years, how strong was that in Paris? Contested. 1.5 just came in, but now the world has said it's 1.5 degrees, so this as a positive development. David told us about the US interest, which of course is huge in the Asia-Pacific region, and that the question of coal financing, but also, and I think that's an important message that came out from today, all the focus on coal is good, necessary, it has to go soon. But we should not forget oil and gas, and if I may allow that, I think the UK presidency conveniently has focused nearly exclusively on coal, which was relatively easy for them, and I at least haven't heard the word gas expressed by Boris Johnson in his various speeches. And I'm grateful to our speakers today that they actually mentioned we need to think beyond that. We cannot replace simply coal by gas and then have the methane problem, which will not make things any better. Further cooperations is obviously the domestic coal phase out between US and Asia Pacific and the methane question. Now, between the big plans, which we hear, which are good, which are laudable, Angela told us there's still far too much money going into fossil fuel subsidies, and without wanting to quote the numbers, a substantial amount of that going into oil and gas. In Korea, this is a big issue. Where you have to look closely, as Solutions for Our Future did, because a lot of it goes into the shipping industry. So at first sight you might think that has nothing to do with climate change. Well, actually these ships are being built to exploit gas and oil resources. We heard from Vietnam, from Khan, we heard from many developments. I think Vietnam was the number one country when it came to the expansion into producing energy by coal. And I think it's good to hear that both the government is revising its energy plan, that the change of international coal finance means that the old plans are no longer feasible, that private money will not flow into it, and that therefore a revision is underway. There's still too much coal, but I think they're positive development, and they will be the more positive, the quicker and the easier it is to go into renewable energy. So we had a mixed picture. We had, I think, quite a number of elements of hope, of improvement, and I think that's important in the light of a very threatening international crisis, global crisis. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gert. Thanks for the enlightening message. This is all we have for today. Thank you very much for our panelists, busy panelists, and although the ambassador is gone, we're very grateful for her attendance today. I hope everybody here had a good time, and thank you very much for coming. Bye-bye.